The ink on the certificate was barely dry when Duke Thaddeus Vane walked into the grand boardroom of the Oakhaven Syndicate for the very first time. He had never set foot in this building. He had never toured the Surrey estate. He had never once asked his father about the ledgers, the tenants, the freight lines, or the river docks that kept one of England's largest private syndicates running. For 29 years, Thaddeus had lived as most young dukes did, between the card tables of Mayfair, the horse races at Epsom, and the tailored drawing rooms of families who wanted their daughters married into old money. Now the old money had a funeral bill, and the empire it built had his name on it. He stood at the head of a long mahogany table, his black morning coat still carrying the faint smell of cemetery soil. 14 senior staff members sat in leather chairs before him, their faces drawn, their hands folded. Behind them, tall windows overlooked the grey London skyline, the rooftops slick with November rain. A solicitor named Crawley had read the will aloud that morning. The terms were complicated, layered with conditions his father had clearly spent years constructing. The estate, the manufacturing operations, the river freight network, the tenant farms across Surrey, all of it fell to Thaddeus, but only under one binding condition. He had to assume direct operational control within 30 days, or the entire syndicate would be dissolved and its assets distributed among creditors. Thaddeus had spent the carriage ride from the solicitor's office staring out the rain-streaked window, turning that condition over in his mind. His father had known. The old duke had known that his son would try to sell it all and walk away with a fortune. So he had written the will like a cage: step inside and run it, or watch it burn. Fine. He would step inside. "Gentlemen," Thaddeus said, pulling off his gloves one finger at a time and setting them on the polished table. "I'll be brief, because I don't believe in wasting time, mine or yours." He looked around the room, older men mostly, gray whiskers, ink-stained cuffs, the kind of men who had spent decades buried in paperwork while the world changed around them. "My father built this syndicate from a single textile mill 40 years ago," Thaddeus continued, "and from what I've seen in the preliminary accounts Mr. Crawley shared with me this morning, the syndicate has been bleeding money for the last 3 years. Revenue is down, the freight operation is running at a loss, 2 of the 4 manufacturing plants are behind on their quarterly output, and the tenant farms haven't turned a meaningful profit since the drought 2 summers ago." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "I intend to fix all of it, and I intend to do it quickly." A few of the men shifted in their seats. One of them, a stout fellow with round spectacles, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if I may, your father had systems in place that—" "My father is dead, Mr. Whitmore." Thaddeus's voice carried no cruelty, but it carried no warmth either. "And respectfully, the systems he had in place are the reason this syndicate is sinking. I've already contacted 3 auditing firms in the city. They'll begin a full review of every ledger, every contract, and every shipment record by the end of this week." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He opened it and placed it flat on the table. "This is a list of structural changes effective immediately. I'll be appointing a new executive board drawn from established London firms, men with modern commercial experience, men who understand how an operation of this scale should function in the current decade." He ran his finger down the list. "The heads of river freight, manufacturing, and tenant relations will report directly to me. All department clerks will be reassigned pending the audit review." A woman's voice came from the far end of the table. "All department clerks, Your Grace?" Thaddeus looked up. She sat in the last chair on the left side of the table, close to the door, as if she had positioned herself to be the least visible person in the room. She wore a plain grey dress with a high collar and no jewelry. Her dark hair was pinned back tightly, and her hands rested on a thick, leather-bound ledger she had brought with her. She was younger than the others, perhaps 25 or 26, and she watched him with a calm, level gaze that held no trace of the nervousness that filled the rest of the room. "And you are?" Thaddeus asked. "Corinne Vance, chief clerk of the Oakhaven Syndicate." A few of the older men glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as though her speaking had broken some unwritten rule. Thaddeus studied her for a moment. Chief Clerk. He had seen the title on the payroll summary. The role was responsible for coordinating the daily operations between the estate's various departments: freight schedules, tenant payments, supplier invoices, manufacturing output. It was the kind of position that sounded important on paper, but, in his view, simply meant she was the person who kept everyone else's paperwork in order.
"Miss Vance," he said, "I appreciate your years of service, but the restructuring I'm implementing requires a different kind of leadership. I'll be bringing in experienced directors from established firms to oversee each division. Your role, as it currently exists, will be absorbed into the new executive structure."
"You're dismissing me," she said. It wasn't a question.
"I'm restructuring the organization." Corinne looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up her ledger, pushed her chair back, and stood.
"Your Grace," she said, "that ledger your auditors will be reviewing, the Master Operations Log. I wrote every entry in it for the last 6 years. Every freight route, every canal schedule, every tenant contract renewal, every quarterly reconciliation. If your new directors have questions about any of it, they'll need someone who understands the system your father built."
Thaddeus almost smiled. He had heard this kind of speech before, the loyal employee making one last plea to prove they were indispensable. It never worked, because the truth was that no single person ever was. "I'm sure my team will manage, Miss Vance. Thank you." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she tucked the ledger under her arm, gave a small nod, and walked out of the boardroom without another word. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Thaddeus turned back to the remaining staff and straightened his cuffs. "Now then, let's discuss the transition timeline." Mr. Whitmore, the stout man with spectacles, leaned forward hesitantly.
"Your Grace, I feel I should mention, Miss Vance is the only person alive who knows the full canal routing system. Her father designed the original waterway infrastructure for the estate before he passed."
Thaddeus waved a hand. "Canals, Mr. Whitmore. We're running a modern syndicate, not punting boats through marshland. The railway connections are what matter now." Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it again and sat back. Thaddeus placed both hands flat on the table and looked around the room with the confidence of a man who had already decided how this story would end. "She won't survive a month of this restructuring," he said. "None of the old systems will. By the time I'm finished, this estate will run the way it should have been running for the last decade." The men around the table nodded slowly, because that was what men did when a duke spoke with certainty. 3 weeks later, the entire operation collapsed. The Surrey countryside was beautiful in late autumn, but Thaddeus Vane had no interest in beauty. He had come to Oakhaven Manor because his London auditors had sent him a telegram that read, in careful professional language, something very close to a confession of failure. The manor itself was a sprawling stone estate surrounded by rolling farmland, dense woodland, and a network of rivers and canals that fed into the freight docks to the south. His father had built the entire operation around this land. The textile mills drew water from the rivers, the tenant farm supplied raw wool and flax, and the canal system carried finished goods to the railway depot and onward to London. It was, Thaddeus was beginning to realize, far more complicated than anything he had seen on paper. He arrived by coach on a grey Tuesday morning and found chaos. The main estate office, a long brick building adjacent to the manor house, was filled with London men in expensive suits who looked completely lost. Ledgers were stacked on every surface. Freight manifests were pinned to walls in overlapping layers. 2 of the auditors were arguing loudly over a tenant contract that referenced a parcel of land none of them could locate on any map. Gerald Ashworth, the lead auditor Thaddeus had personally hired from one of the city's most respected firms, met him at the door with ink on his collar and dark circles under his eyes. "Your Grace, I must be candid with you," Ashworth said, guiding him through the crowded office.
We have been here for 18 days and we cannot reconcile a single quarter. Thaddeus stopped walking. What do you mean, not a single quarter? I mean exactly that, sir. The bookkeeping system your father used does not follow any standard method we've encountered. The ledgers reference codes, route numbers, canal designations, tenant parcel identifiers, that don't appear in any index we can find. The freight schedules are written in a shorthand that none of my men can read, and the tenant contracts contain cross-references to engineering documents that seem to be stored somewhere else entirely. Thaddeus felt a tightness in his jaw. You're telling me that 12 trained auditors from the finest firm in London cannot read a set of country ledgers? Ashworth removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, which Thaddeus recognized as the gesture of a man buying time. Sir, these are not country ledgers. This is one of the most intricate private accounting systems I have ever seen. Whoever maintained it understood every thread of this estate's operations simultaneously. The manufacturing output, the freight logistics, the tenant yields, the canal maintenance, the seasonal weather adjustments. It all connects. And without the person who understood those connections, we are reading a book in a language we do not speak. The words landed harder than Thaddeus expected. He spent the rest of the morning walking through the offices, watching his expensive team fumble through stacks of records. 2 freight shipments had already been delayed because nobody could confirm the correct canal routing. A tenant dispute over grazing rights had gone unanswered for a week because the original contract was written in the same coded shorthand. The manufacturing plant foreman had come to the office 3 times asking for his quarterly supply allocation, and each time he had been told to wait. The estate was losing roughly £400 a day. Thaddeus could feel the number like a wound. By late afternoon, he had retreated to his father's private study on the 2nd floor of the manor. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Shelves lined every wall, filled with books and rolled documents. A portrait of his father hung above the fireplace, a stern-faced man with silver hair and the same sharp jaw that Thaddeus saw in his own mirror each morning. He sat at his father's desk and began pulling open drawers, searching for anything that might help him decode the ledger system. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old correspondence, he found a payroll registry dated from the current quarter. He ran his finger down the list of names and departments. Most of the senior staff he had dismissed or reassigned were listed with termination dates beside their names. Then his finger stopped. Corinne Vance. Her name was still on the active payroll, but her title had changed. Where it once read Chief Clerk, Operations, it now read Data Clerk, Basement Archives, Grade 1. Grade 1. The lowest clerical rank on the estate. The pay was barely above what the groundskeepers earned. Thaddeus stared at the entry. He had dismissed her 3 weeks ago in the London boardroom. She had walked out without protest. He had assumed she had gone home, taken her severance, perhaps found a position at another estate. She hadn't left. She had demoted herself. He closed the registry and sat very still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the estate through the window. The distant clatter of a freight wagon, the shout of a dock worker, the steady rhythm of the textile mill's water wheel turning in the river. Then he stood up, took a lamp from the desk, and walked downstairs. The basement of Oakhaven Manor was a series of low-ceilinged stone rooms connected by narrow corridors, originally built as wine cellars and storage vaults. The air was cool and damp, and the lamplight threw long shadows across the rough walls. He followed the corridor until he saw a faint glow coming from beneath a heavy oak door at the far end. He pushed it open. The room beyond was small, windowless, and packed with filing cabinets, rolled maps, and wooden crates full of bound documents. A single oil lamp burned on a wide desk in the center, and behind that desk sat Corinne Vance. She looked up at him with the same calm expression she had worn in the London boardroom. She was still in a plain gray dress, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her fingers stained with ink. In front of her lay 3 open ledgers, a large hand-drawn map of the estate's canal system, and a stack of freight manifests she was clearly in the middle of sorting. She did not look surprised to see him. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I was wondering when you'd find your way down here." Thaddeus set the lamp down on the edge of her desk and looked around the room. Every surface was covered in organized stacks of paperwork. The filing cabinets along the walls had small labels written in neat handwriting: canal routes, tenant leases, freight manifests, mill output, seasonal projections. It was the most orderly space he had seen on the entire estate. "You demoted yourself," he said. "I transferred," Corinne corrected, without looking up from the manifest she was marking. "The restructuring eliminated my position. It did not eliminate the work." "You went from chief clerk to the lowest grade on the payroll. You're earning less than the stable hands." "The stable hands do important work, Your Grace." Thaddeus pulled a wooden stool from the corner and sat down across from her. He was not accustomed to being in rooms like this, cramped, underground, smelling of damp stone and old paper. He was not accustomed to sitting on stools, and he was certainly not accustomed to having his decisions quietly undone by someone he had already removed. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked. Corinne set down her pen and finally met his eyes. "Because if I left, the freight routing would have collapsed within a fortnight. Your auditors can read numbers, Your Grace. They cannot read this estate. The ledger system your father and I built together is not something you learn from a textbook. It took me 4 years to master, and it took your father a lifetime to design." "You built it together?" "He designed the framework. I maintained and expanded it after his health began to decline. For the last 2 years of his life, I ran the daily operations almost entirely on my own. He trusted me with it." Thaddeus absorbed this quietly. His father had never mentioned Corinne in any letter. He had never mentioned much of anything about the estate's inner workings, perhaps because he had assumed his son would never care enough to ask. He had been right about that. "My auditors tell me they cannot reconcile the books," Thaddeus said. "They say the coding system is unlike anything they've encountered." Corinne reached across the desk and pulled one of the open ledgers toward him. She turned it so he could see the columns. Each entry contained a series of letters and numbers, things like CR7N, TP14W, ML3E, followed by financial figures. "Every code has 3 parts," she explained, running her finger along a row. "The first 2 letters identify the department. CR is canal routing, TP is tenant parcels, ML is mill logistics. The number identifies the specific asset, Route 7, Parcel 14, Mill 3, and the final letter marks the compass position on the estate map, north, west, east." Thaddeus looked at the page with fresh eyes. What had appeared to his auditors as impenetrable shorthand was in fact a precise geographic accounting system. Every financial entry was tied to a physical location on the estate. "Your father wanted to see the money moving across the land," Corinne said. "He did not think of the estate as a set of numbers in a bank. He thought of it as a living thing. Rivers feeding mills, mills producing goods, goods traveling canals, canals reaching railways. Every pound earned had a place on the map where it was born." Thaddeus leaned back on the stool. He was beginning to understand something uncomfortable, that his father had been far more brilliant than he had ever given him credit for, and that this woman sitting in a basement, earning stable hand wages, understood that brilliance in a way he never would. "Show me the losses," he said. Corinne studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether he actually wanted to see what she was about to show him. Then she pulled the large, hand-drawn map from beneath the ledgers and spread it across the desk. It was a detailed rendering of the entire Oakhaven estate. Every river, canal, road, building, mill, farm, and dock drawn in fine ink. Small colored pins were stuck into various points on the map, each one trailing a thin thread to a note written in the margin. "The estate has been losing money for 3 years," Corinne said. Your auditors assumed the losses came from declining production or poor tenant yields. That is what the surface numbers suggest. And you disagree? She picked up a red pin from the edge of the map and placed it on a point near the main estate offices. 3 years ago, your father appointed a new executive board to handle the syndicate's London-facing finances. 5 men, all brought in from outside. They were given authority over the treasury accounts, the investment portfolio, and the annual distribution of profits to shareholders. She traced her finger along a series of entries in the ledger beside the map. Since their appointment, the estate's gross revenue has actually increased by 11%. The mills are producing more. The tenant farms had one poor season but recovered. The freight operation has been steady. Thaddeus frowned. Then where is the money going? Exactly the right question. Corinne pulled a second ledger from a drawer beneath the desk. This one was thinner, with a dark green cover. I started keeping this 18 months ago when the numbers stopped making sense. Every quarter, the executive board submits a financial summary to the shareholders, and every quarter, the figures in their summary are different from the figures in the operational ledgers I maintain. She opened the green ledger and placed it beside the official one. The columns were laid out identically, but the numbers diverged, sometimes by hundreds, sometimes by thousands of pounds. Someone on that board is draining the estate, Corinne said, systematically, carefully, small amounts at first, growing larger each quarter. They are hiding it inside inflated expense reports, false supplier invoices, and ghost freight shipments that never actually moved any goods. Thaddeus stared at the 2 ledgers lying side by side. The evidence was meticulous. Every discrepancy was dated, sourced, and cross-referenced. "Why didn't you bring this to my father?" he asked. Corinne's expression shifted for the first time. Something passed across her face, a shadow of something old and heavy. "I did," she said quietly. 3 weeks before he died, he told me he would handle it personally. Then his heart gave out, and you walked into the boardroom and dismissed the only person who knew any of this existed. The silence that followed sat between them like a third presence in the room. Thaddeus looked at the map, at the ledgers, at the pins and threads connecting money to land and land to theft. Then he looked at Corinne Vance, sitting in a windowless basement in a plain gray dress, doing the work that was keeping his inheritance from falling apart. "What do you need from me?" he asked. It was the first honest question he had asked since his father died. The crisis came on a Monday morning in early January, when the temperature dropped so low that the iron fittings on the main river lock cracked clean through. Thaddeus heard the news from a breathless dock worker who had run 2 miles uphill from the river to the manor house. The man stood in the entrance hall, dripping mud onto the marble floor, his cap in his hands, his face red from the cold. "The whole lock seized, Your Grace. Gate won't open, won't close. There's 11 barges loaded with finished cotton sitting in the channel below, and the wool shipment from the northern farms is backed up behind them. Nothing's moving." Thaddeus dismissed the man and immediately sent for Geoffrey Holt, the operations director he had appointed from London 6 weeks earlier. Holt arrived 20 minutes later, looking pale. "How long to repair the lock?" Thaddeus asked. "The ironworks foreman says 3 weeks minimum. The gate mechanism needs to be completely recast. The cold has warped the main housing beyond repair." 3 weeks. Thaddeus gripped the edge of his desk. "We have contracts with 4 London buyers expecting delivery by the end of this month. Those 11 barges carry goods worth over £30,000. If we miss the delivery window, we pay penalties on every single contract." Holt spread his hands helplessly. "Your Grace, the lock is the only passage between the upper canal and the river. There is no alternative route." "There must be something. A bypass, an overland road." "The roads are frozen solid, and half of them are buried under snow. We'd need 50 wagons and twice as many horses, and even then the journey would take 4 days each way. We'd never make the deadline." Thaddeus stood at the window of his study, staring out at the white landscape. The river was a dark line cutting through the snow-covered fields, and he could just make out the shapes of the stranded barges clustered below the broken lock. £30,000 sitting in frozen water, and every hour that passed cost him more. He sent for Corinne. She arrived within the quarter hour, still wearing her work apron, ink on her fingers as usual. She had been reinstated as chief clerk 10 days earlier, though she had refused the formal title and insisted on being listed simply as clerk operations on the payroll. Thaddeus had learned quickly that arguing with her about such things was a waste of breath. "The main lock is broken," he told her. "Holt says there's no bypass." Corinne walked to the large estate map that now hung permanently on the wall of his study, the same hand-drawn map she had shown him in the basement archives. She studied it for a long moment, her eyes tracing the blue lines of the waterways. "Mr. Holt is thinking of the modern canal system," she said. "The one your father expanded 15 years ago. He's correct. That system has only one passage through the lock." "Then we're finished." "There is an older system." Corinne placed her finger on a section of the map that Thaddeus had never paid attention to. It showed a series of thin, winding blue lines, branching off the main canal to the west, threading through woodland and farmland, before reconnecting with the river several miles downstream of the broken lock. Small notations in faded ink marked distances and depth measurements along each line. "My father surveyed these channels 30 years ago when he first designed the estate's water infrastructure," Corinne said. "They're the original bypass canals, natural waterways that the local farmers used for centuries before your father built the modern lock system. When the new canals were finished, everyone forgot about them." Thaddeus looked at the thin blue lines on the map. "Are they still navigable?" "For the large freight barges, no. The channels are too narrow and too shallow. But for smaller vessels, the old horse-drawn flat barges that the farms used to transport grain, they should be passable." "We don't have horse-drawn barges." "We do. There are 14 of them stored in the boat shed behind the old mill on the west bank. My father kept them maintained as a contingency. I've been checking on them every spring since he died." Thaddeus turned from the map to look at her. "You've been maintaining boats that nobody knew existed, on your own, for years." "My father built them. It seemed wrong to let them rot." He almost said something about sentimentality, but the number 30,000 was louder than his pride. "Can it work?" he asked. Corinne was already pulling on her coat. "I'll need every available dock worker and 20 horses from the estate stables. The goods will have to be offloaded from the large barges, divided into smaller loads, and transferred to the flat barges at the western inlet. The bypass route adds 6 miles, but the current is gentle and the channels are sheltered from the wind. If we start within the hour, we can move the first shipments through by nightfall." Thaddeus gave the order immediately. What followed was the most extraordinary logistical operation the estate had ever seen. Corinne stationed herself at the western inlet where the bypass canals began, directing the transfer of cargo from the stranded freight barges to the smaller flat vessels. She knew every channel by heart, which ones were deep enough for loaded barges, which ones had low bridges requiring the goods to be covered, which ones narrowed at certain points where 2 boats could not pass at the same time. She coordinated the horse teams along the towpaths, managed the rotation of empty barges returning for fresh loads, and kept a running tally of every crate transferred in a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. By midnight, the first 7 loads had cleared the bypass and reached the open river below the broken lock. By Wednesday evening, all 11 barges' worth of goods had been moved through the old channels and reloaded onto waiting vessels at the downstream dock. The delivery contracts were met with 2 days to spare. Thaddeus watched the final barge clear the last bypass channel from the towpath above, his boots ankle-deep in frozen mud. Corinne stood beside him, her face raw from the cold, her gloves soaked through, her breath rising in white clouds. "Your father designed all of this?" he asked quietly. "Every inch of it," she said. "He always said that the old ways and the new ways should work together. One without the other was just half an answer." Thaddeus said nothing for a long while. The river moved slowly beneath them, carrying the estate's fortunes southward through the winter dark. He was beginning to understand that he had inherited far more than a syndicate. He had inherited a mind, his father's mind, preserved in waterways and ledgers and blueprints by the one person he had tried to throw away. February brought gray skies and a cold that settled into the bones of the manor like a permanent guest. Thaddeus had moved his personal quarters from the grand master bedroom on the upper floor to a smaller room adjacent to his father's study, partly for convenience and partly because he had started spending most of his waking hours at the old Duke's desk, reading through decades of correspondence and financial records. He was learning, slowly, painfully, and with the constant awareness that he should have started years ago. Corinne had given him a private education in the estate's operations over the past several weeks. She would appear in his study each morning at 7 o'clock with a fresh pot of tea and a stack of documents, and she would walk him through a different section of the business. The mill production cycles, the tenant lease structures, the freight scheduling, the seasonal fluctuations in wool and cotton prices. She explained everything with patience and clarity, never condescending, never reminding him that he had once dismissed her as unnecessary. Thaddeus found himself looking forward to those morning sessions more than he cared to admit. One evening in mid-February, he was alone in his father's study, going through a cabinet of old architectural plans. Corinne had mentioned that her father, the estate's original architect, had kept detailed drawings of every building, waterway, and road on the property. Most of these drawings were stored in a workshop in the manor's north wing, a dusty, unused room that had been locked since the architect's death 8 years earlier. Thaddeus had obtained the key from the housekeeper that afternoon. He told himself he wanted to understand the estate's physical infrastructure more thoroughly. That was true, but it was only part of the truth. The discrepancies Corinne had shown him in the green ledger had been growing. Someone on the executive board was stealing from the estate, and the pattern was accelerating. If the thief knew that Corinne had been reinstated and was once again tracking the finances closely, they might try to cover their trail. Thaddeus needed to find the original records, the foundational documents that could prove what the estate's true finances looked like before the executive board was appointed. He took a lamp and walked through the cold corridors of the north wing until he reached the workshop door. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan of old hinges. The room beyond was large and cluttered, filled with drafting tables, rolled blueprints, wooden models of buildings, and glass jars containing samples of soil and stone. Dust lay thick on every surface. The air smelled of linseed oil and aged paper. It was the workspace of a man who had thought in structures and measurements, who had seen the world as a series of problems that could be solved with the right drawing. Thaddeus spent an hour carefully unrolling blueprints and examining them by lamplight. He found plans for the canal system, the mill buildings, the tenant farmhouses, the freight depot, and the river docks. Each drawing was exquisitely detailed, annotated in a small, precise hand that reminded him of Corinne's own writing. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd about one of the larger blueprints, a full estate plan showing every structure on the property. The drawing was mounted on a wooden backing board, and the bottom edge of the paper had pulled slightly away from the board, revealing a thin gap. Thaddeus held the lamp closer. There was something behind the blueprint. He carefully peeled the paper back from the wooden board. Beneath it, pressed flat against the wood, were 3 slim, leather-bound notebooks. They had been deliberately hidden there, sandwiched between the blueprint and its backing, invisible unless someone happened to notice the loose edge. He opened the first notebook. The handwriting inside was his father's. Each page was divided into 2 columns. The left column contained entries copied directly from the official syndicate ledgers, the same figures that appeared in the quarterly reports submitted to shareholders. The right column contained a different set of figures, annotated with dates, names, and transaction descriptions. The differences between the 2 columns were damning. Thaddeus turned the pages slowly. His father had been tracking the theft himself. Every false invoice, every ghost shipment, every inflated expense claim. The old Duke had found them all, and recorded them in these hidden notebooks with the same meticulous precision that defined everything he did. And beside each fraudulent entry, written in his father's careful hand, was a single name: Sterling Vane, Thaddeus's uncle, his father's younger brother. A man who sat on the executive board, attended every shareholders' meeting, dined at the manor on holidays, and had clasped Thaddeus's hand at the funeral with tears in his eyes. Thaddeus closed the notebook and sat very still on the dusty floor of the workshop. The lamp flickered beside him, throwing restless shadows across the architect's drawings. He sent for Corinne the following morning. She came to the workshop and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking around the room where her father had spent most of his working life. Thaddeus saw something cross her face, a private grief, quickly folded away, before she stepped inside and joined him at the drafting table where he had laid out the 3 notebooks. She read through them in silence. When she finished, she placed her hand flat on the open page and stared at Sterling's name, written over and over in the old Duke's hand. "Your father knew," she said. "He knew everything. He was building a case," Thaddeus said, "gathering proof. He must have planned to confront Sterling himself. And then he died before he could." Thaddeus nodded. "The will makes more sense now. The condition that I take operational control? He wasn't punishing me. He was making sure someone from the family would be here, on the ground, close enough to find what he had hidden." Corinne looked up at him. "Sterling doesn't know these notebooks exist." "No, and as long as he believes the only evidence is in the operational ledgers, he thinks he's safe. He thinks the mess he's made of the books is too complicated for anyone to untangle. He's been right about that until now." Thaddeus gathered the notebooks and wrapped them in a cloth. "We need to move carefully. If Sterling realizes we found these, he'll destroy every record he can reach. The original contracts, the supplier documents, the freight logs, everything that connects the real numbers to his false ones." Corinne took a slow breath. "Then we don't let him realize. We keep working as if nothing has changed. I'll continue the normal audits with your team, and we build the complete case quietly, using your father's notebooks as the guide." Thaddeus looked at this woman standing in her dead father's workshop, surrounded by the blueprints and plans of a man who had poured his life into building something real and lasting. She had inherited that same quality, the patience to build things properly, layer by layer, until they could bear any weight. "Together, then," Thaddeus said. Corinne met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. Spring arrived late that year, dragging itself across the Surrey hills in fits of weak sunshine and sudden downpours. The estate was running better than it had in years. Freight was moving on schedule, the tenant farms had begun their planting rotations, and the mills were operating at nearly full capacity for the first time since the old Duke's death. Thaddeus had quietly dismissed 3 of the 5 members of the executive board over the previous weeks, replacing them with men Corinne had vetted personally. Each dismissal was handled with care. Generous severance, polite letters of thanks, no accusations. The departing board members left believing they had simply been part of a routine restructuring. Sterling Vane, who remained on the board, had attended each farewell dinner with a warm smile and a glass of port raised in tribute to his departing colleagues. He suspected nothing. Or so Thaddeus believed. The case against Sterling was nearly complete. Corinne had spent weeks cross-referencing the old Duke's hidden notebooks against the official syndicate records, building a document trail so thorough that no solicitor in England could challenge it. Every false invoice had been matched to a real supplier, who confirmed no goods were ever delivered. Every ghost freight shipment had been traced to a canal route that showed no vessel traffic on the dates claimed. Every inflated expense report had been compared to the actual costs recorded in the operational ledgers Corinne maintained. The evidence filled 2 locked trunks in Thaddeus's study, but the most critical pieces, the original contracts, the master freight logs, and the founding financial records of the syndicate were stored in the secure vault beneath the Central Railway Freight Station, 3 miles south of the manor. These were the documents that established the baseline figures against which Sterling's fraud could be measured. Without them, the hidden notebooks were just one man's private suspicions. On a Wednesday evening in late March, Thaddeus received a message from the freight station foreman. There had been a structural concern reported in the main warehouse, cracking in the eastern wall, possible instability in the roof timbers. An engineer had recommended clearing the building as a precaution while an inspection was carried out. Thaddeus thought nothing of it. Old buildings developed old problems. He approved the temporary closure and went to bed. Corinne knocked on his door at 4 in the morning. She was dressed in her heavy wool coat, her hair loose around her shoulders, which told him she had come in a hurry. Her expression was something he had never seen before, controlled, focused, but with a sharpness in her eyes that looked close to alarm.
"The structural report is false," she said. "I spoke with the foreman an hour ago. He told me the engineer who filed the report was not the estate's regular surveyor. He was a man none of the dock workers recognized, hired through a letter of introduction that came from London."
Thaddeus was fully awake now. Sterling.
"The foreman also told me that 3 men arrived at the freight station this evening with a wagon and began removing crates from the warehouse. They told the night watchman they were relocating materials ahead of the inspection. The watchman let them in because they carried a letter bearing a board member's seal."
Thaddeus was already pulling on his boots. The vault. If they reach the vault.
"They won't have the combination. Only your father knew it, and he left it in his private papers,
which are here in the manor. But they don't need to open the vault if they bring the building down on top of it. Enough rubble and water damage would destroy everything inside." Thaddeus grabbed his coat, and they rode out together in a horse-drawn trap through the dark countryside. The freight station was a large timber and brick structure built alongside the railway line, with a cobbled yard and loading platforms extending toward the canal. As they approached, Thaddeus could see lamplight moving inside the warehouse through the high windows. They arrived to find the night watchman sitting in his booth, looking confused and frightened. He confirmed that 3 men had entered the warehouse 2 hours earlier and had been working inside since. He had heard hammering and the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the stone floor. Thaddeus sent Corinne to the foreman's cottage to wake him and gather whatever men could be assembled quickly. Then he walked into the warehouse alone. The interior was vast and cold, filled with rows of wooden shipping crates stacked to the ceiling. At the far end, he could see the iron door of the secure vault set into the brick wall. 3 men were working around the base of the wall with crowbars and hammers, attempting to weaken the brickwork surrounding the vault door. One of them had already loosened several large stones from the foundation. "Stop what you're doing," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying across the empty warehouse. "This building and everything in it belongs to the Oakhaven Syndicate, and I am ordering you to step away." The men turned. They were rough-looking fellows, hired muscle, the kind of men who did work for coin and asked no questions. The largest of them looked at Thaddeus with the dull calculation of someone weighing whether a duke was worth the trouble. Before the calculation could finish, the foreman arrived through the loading doors with 6 estate workers carrying lanterns and heavy tools. Corinne walked in behind them, carrying the vault combination written on a slip of paper she had retrieved from the old duke's private correspondence. The hired men dropped their crowbars and left through the yard without a word. They knew when a job was finished. Thaddeus and Corinne opened the vault together. Inside, the original contracts, the master freight ledgers, and the founding financial records of the Oakhaven Syndicate sat undisturbed on their iron shelves, exactly where the old duke had placed them years ago. Corinne ran her fingers along the spines of the ledgers, checking each one against a list she carried in her coat pocket. When she was satisfied, she looked at Thaddeus. "He's getting desperate," she said. "A man who sends strangers to tear down walls in the middle of the night is a man who knows the ground is shrinking beneath him." Thaddeus locked the vault and pocketed the key. "Then we move faster. I want every document in this vault transported to the manor tonight, and tomorrow morning I'm sending a letter to the family solicitor requesting Sterling's immediate suspension from the board.
Corinne shook her head. Not yet. Suspend him now and he'll claim you're acting on personal grudge. We need the annual general meeting. We present everything in front of the full shareholder body, with witnesses, with the original records on the table. He walks in expecting a routine assembly and walks into the complete truth. Thaddeus studied her face in the vault's lamplight. She was right, and he knew it. Patience was the weapon she had been sharpening for months.
The annual meeting is in 9 weeks, he said.
Then we have 9 weeks to make this untouchable.
The blizzard came without warning on the second Tuesday of April. April storms were rare in Surrey, but the old farmers on the tenant lands had been watching the sky for days. A strange yellow haze had settled over the hills to the north, and the cattle had refused to leave their shelters since Sunday morning. The barometric glass in Thaddeus's study had been falling steadily for 48 hours. When the storm hit, it came from the northeast with a fury that belonged more to the Scottish Highlands than the gentle English countryside. Within 3 hours, the roads between the manor and the manufacturing plants were buried under 2 feet of snow. The telegraph line connecting the estate offices to the railway depot snapped under the weight of ice sometime before noon. By evening, the entire northern half of the estate was cut off from the south. This was the worst possible timing. The syndicate's largest seasonal distribution was scheduled for the end of the month, a massive shipment of finished textiles bound for buyers in London, Bristol, and Liverpool. The goods were being assembled at 3 separate manufacturing plants across the estate, coordinated through a careful schedule that Corinne had built over the previous weeks. Each plant was producing a specific portion of the order, and the timing depended on all 3 plants communicating daily to match their output with the available freight capacity. Now, there was no communication at all. Thaddeus stood at the window of his study, watching the snow bury the grounds. The wind was howling through the chimneys of the manor, and the servants had begun boarding up windows on the eastern side of the house. He could see nothing beyond the gardens. The landscape had dissolved into a white wall of driving snow. Corinne found him there an hour later.
She had a map rolled under her arm and a leather satchel over her shoulder. The northern plants can operate independently for 2 or 3 days, she said, spreading the map across his desk. They have enough raw materials, and their workers live close enough to walk in. The problem is coordination. If the 3 plants continue producing without knowing what the others are doing, the shipment quantities won't match. We'll end up with too much of one fabric and too little of another, and the buyers will reject the order. We can't reach them, the roads are impassable, and the telegraph is down. Corinne placed her finger on a small square marked on the map, high on the ridge between the northern and southern halves of the estate. This is the High Pass outpost. My father built it as a survey station when he was mapping the northern waterways. It sits on the ridgeline with a clear view of both valleys. There's a signal tower on the roof, a simple mirror and lamp system he designed for communicating with the canal workers during fog. Thaddeus looked at the tiny square on the map. It was high up, exposed, and the trail leading to it wound through dense woodland that would be treacherous in this weather.
You want to ride up there in the middle of a blizzard?
I want us to ride up there, Corinne said. The signal system can reach the foreman at each plant, but someone needs to be at the outpost to receive their replies and coordinate the production schedule in real time. That requires someone who knows the manufacturing output tables and someone who has the authority to make decisions on behalf of the syndicate. She looked at him steadily. That means both of us. They left at dawn the following morning, riding 2 of the estate's sturdiest horses along a woodland trail that was barely visible beneath the snow. Corinne led the way, following landmarks her father had taught her as a girl, a distinctive oak split by lightning, a stone wall marking an old parish boundary, a frozen stream crossing where the ice was thickest near the eastern bank. Thaddeus followed in silence, his collar pulled high against the wind, his hands numb inside his gloves. The outpost was a small stone cabin perched on the exposed ridge, half buried in drifted snow. The signal tower rose from its roof, a wooden platform with a large, polished mirror mounted on a pivot and a hooded oil lamp beside it.
Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A cast-iron stove, a cot, a desk, a store of tinned food and firewood that Corinne had restocked the previous autumn. She lit the stove while Thaddeus cleared the snow from the signal tower platform. By mid-morning, they had established contact with the foreman at the nearest plant using the mirror system, long and short flashes of reflected sunlight that conveyed simple, coded messages. It was slow, painstaking work. Each message took several minutes to transmit and receive, and the codes had to be translated against a chart that Corinne kept folded in her satchel. For 3 days, they lived in that cabin on the ridge. They slept in shifts, one resting on the cot while the other manned the signal tower.
They ate tinned beef and hard biscuits and drank tea brewed on the stove. The wind never stopped, and the cold crept through every gap in the stone walls. During the long hours between signal exchanges, they talked. Thaddeus told Corinne things he had never told anyone, about the distance between himself and his father, about the years wasted on card games and horse races while the old Duke built something real. Corinne spoke about her own father, the architect who had poured his genius into an estate that belonged to another family and who had died quietly in his workshop one autumn evening with a half-finished blueprint on his desk. On the third evening, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a hard, cold blue, and the setting sun turned the snow-covered landscape into a sheet of copper and gold. They stood together on the signal tower platform and watched the light move across the valleys below, where the 3 manufacturing plants sent their final production figures blinking up through the fading daylight. Every number matched. The shipment would be complete and on schedule. Thaddeus looked at Corinne standing beside him in the dying light, her face chapped from the wind, her eyes tired but calm. She had not complained once in 3 days. She had eaten the same bad food, endured the same freezing nights, and worked the same brutal hours without ever suggesting that any of it was beneath her or beyond her. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what I said in the boardroom that first day." Corinne kept her eyes on the valley. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. You didn't know." "That's exactly the point. I didn't know, and I didn't bother to learn. I looked at you and saw a clerk. I should have looked harder." She turned to him then, and for a moment, the professional distance she had always maintained between them softened into something warmer. "You're looking now," she said. "That's what matters." They rode back down to the manor the following morning, side by side through the melting snow. The annual general meeting was 12 days away, when Sterling Vane made his final move. Thaddeus received word from the syndicate's London banker on a Friday afternoon. A withdrawal request had been submitted bearing the seal of the Oakhaven Executive Board, a request to liquidate the syndicate's remaining cash reserves and transfer them to a private holding account registered under a shipping company in Liverpool. The amount was staggering. Nearly every liquid pound the estate possessed. The banker, a cautious man named Hadwell, who had served the Vane family for 30 years, had delayed processing the request because the signature on the authorization did not match the Duke's hand. It matched Sterling's. Thaddeus read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. He found Corinne in the estate office, reviewing the final draft of the case file they had been preparing for the shareholders' meeting. "He's emptying the accounts," Thaddeus said, handing her the banker's letter. Corinne read it, with the same focused calm she brought to everything. When she finished, she set the letter down and looked at the calendar pinned to the wall beside her desk.
"The transfer requires physical authorization at the bank vault,"
she said.
"Both the board seal and a signed instrument of transfer must be presented in person. Sterling will have to go to Hadwell's bank himself."
"When?"
"The request specifies Monday morning. If Sterling completes the transfer before the annual meeting, the syndicate's operating capital will be gone. Every contract, every salary, every freight payment, all of it depends on those reserves. He's planning to gut the estate and disappear before we can present the evidence."
Thaddeus paced the length of the office. 9 weeks of careful preparation, and Sterling was trying to burn the house down before they could lock the doors. "We go to London," he said. We meet him at the vault." They took the Saturday morning train from the estate's private halt, carrying 2 heavy document cases between them. One contained the old Duke's hidden notebooks, now indexed and annotated by Corinne. The other held the original contracts and founding records retrieved from the freight station vault, along with the complete reconciliation showing every pound sterling had stolen over the past decade. Corinne had also prepared a single summary document, 40 pages of precise, cross-referenced evidence that laid out the entire fraud from its first modest entries to its most recent enormous withdrawals. She had written it in clear, plain language that any shareholder or magistrate could follow without specialized financial knowledge. It was, Thaddeus thought, the most devastating piece of accounting he had ever seen. They arrived in London on Saturday evening and took rooms at a quiet hotel near the Strand. Thaddeus sent a message to Hadwell asking him to delay Monday's appointment by 1 hour, citing a procedural review. Hadwell, who had already sensed that something was deeply wrong, agreed without question. On Monday morning, Thaddeus and Corinne arrived at the bank 30 minutes before Sterling's scheduled appointment. Hadwell led them through the marble corridors to the private vault room, a windowless chamber lined with iron deposit boxes and lit by gas lamps mounted in brass fittings along the walls. A heavy oak table occupied the center of the room, and it was here that Corinne laid out the evidence. She arranged the documents with the same precision she brought to everything. The hidden notebooks open to the most damning pages, the original contracts beside the falsified versions, the summary document at the center where it could not be missed. When she finished, the table told the story of 10 years of systematic theft in a language that required no translation. They waited. Sterling arrived at 10:30, walking through the vault room door with the confidence of a man who believed he was collecting his winnings. He wore a fine charcoal suit and carried a leather portfolio under his arm. His expression was pleasant, almost cheerful. He had the look of someone finishing a long and profitable game. Then he saw Thaddeus standing beside the table. Then he saw Corinne. Then he saw the documents. The color left his face in stages, like ink draining from a cloth held under running water. His eyes moved across the notebooks, the contracts, the summary document. He recognized his brother's handwriting immediately. Thaddeus could see it in the way his jaw tightened and his fingers gripped the portfolio. "Sit down, Uncle," Thaddeus said. Sterling did not sit. He stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between the documents and the exit behind him. "This is my brother's private correspondence," Sterling said, his voice carrying a thin veneer of composure. "You have no authority to remove personal papers from the estate." "These are not personal papers," Corinne said, stepping forward. "These are financial records documenting fraudulent transactions conducted against the Oakhaven Syndicate over a period of 10 years. Every entry has been verified against the original founding contracts, which are here on this table, and against the operational ledgers I have maintained since your brother appointed me as chief clerk." She picked up the summary document and held it where Sterling could see the first page. "This document contains 147 individual instances of fraud, false supplier invoices, fabricated freight shipments, inflated expense claims, and unauthorized transfers to accounts registered in your name. The total amount exceeds £90,000. Sterling's composure cracked. He looked at Thaddeus with an expression that shifted rapidly between outrage and something closer to fear. "Your father would never have wanted this," Sterling said. "Family matters should be handled privately, Thaddeus. We can discuss this between ourselves, reach an understanding." "My father did want this," Thaddeus said quietly. "He spent the last months of his life building this case. He wrote every page of those notebooks himself. The only reason he didn't finish what he started is because his heart stopped before he could." The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the gas lamps. Sterling looked at the table one more time. Then he looked at Corinne, and in his expression, Thaddeus saw something that surprised him.
recognition. Sterling had always known who the real threat was. He had always known that the quiet clerk with the ink-stained fingers was the one person who could unravel everything he had built in the shadows.
"What do you want?" Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Your resignation from the board," Thaddeus said. "Your voting shares surrendered to the syndicate, and your signature on a document acknowledging the full amount owed. In return, this matter remains between these walls and does not go before a magistrate." Sterling closed his eyes. When he opened them, the fight was gone. He sat down at the table, and Corinne placed a pen beside his hand. The Grand Assembly Hall on Threadneedle Street had been built 40 years earlier by a consortium of merchant families who believed that business should be conducted in surroundings that reminded everyone of its importance. The ceiling rose 30 feet above the polished floor, supported by columns of Portland stone. Tall, arched windows lined the eastern wall, filling the room with the pale gold light of a June morning.
Rows of carved wooden benches faced a raised platform at the front, where a mahogany lectern stood beside a long table draped in green baize. By 10 o'clock, every bench was occupied. The shareholders of the Oakhaven Syndicate had come from across England. Wool merchants from Yorkshire, textile buyers from Manchester, shipping agents from Bristol, and a dozen London financiers who held significant portions of the syndicate's stock. They filled the hall with the low murmur of men conducting private conversations while waiting for the official proceedings to begin. Programs had been printed and distributed at the door, listing the standard agenda: financial review, operational report, dividend announcement, board elections. None of them knew what was actually about to happen. Thaddeus stood in a small anteroom behind the platform, adjusting his cuffs. He wore a dark blue frock coat, freshly pressed, with a white cravat and polished boots. He looked every inch the young Duke who had walked into the London boardroom 6 months earlier with the certainty that he could reshape an empire by sheer force of will. He felt like an entirely different man. Corinne was beside him, reviewing a sheaf of notes she had prepared for the presentation. She wore a deep green dress, the first time Thaddeus had seen her in anything other than the plain gray she favored for daily work. Her hair was pinned neatly, and she carried the same leather-bound ledger she had brought to that first boardroom meeting, the one she had tucked under her arm when he dismissed her. "Are you ready?" she asked, without looking up from her notes. "I've been rehearsing since yesterday evening, and I still don't think I've found the right words." "You'll find them. You always seem to when it matters." Thaddeus smiled slightly. 6 months ago, she would never have spoken to him with that kind of easy familiarity. 6 months ago, he would not have deserved it. A clerk opened the anteroom door and informed them that the hall was ready. Thaddeus walked to the lectern. The murmur in the hall faded as the shareholders settled into their seats and turned their attention to the platform. He could see their faces, expectant, cautious, some openly skeptical. Many of them had watched the syndicate's decline over the past 3 years and had serious doubts about whether the young Duke, who had never run so much as a market stall, could reverse its fortunes. He gripped the edges of the lectern and began. 6 months ago, I stood in the boardroom of this syndicate and made a series of declarations. I told the senior staff that I would restructure the entire operation. I told them that the old systems were failing and that modern leadership would save us. And I dismissed the one person in the room who actually understood how this estate worked. He paused. The hall was completely silent. I told the room that she would not survive a month of my restructuring. I was wrong about that. The truth is that the estate did not survive a month without her. He looked toward the side of the platform, where Corinne sat in a chair beside the green baize table. She met his gaze steadily, her hands resting on the ledger in her lap. Miss Corinne Vance served as chief clerk of the Oakhaven Syndicate for 6 years. During that time, she maintained every operational ledger, managed every freight schedule, coordinated every tenant contract, and kept the daily machinery of this estate running with a level of competence that I have never seen matched by anyone.
including myself. He turned back to the shareholders. When I dismissed her, she did something remarkable. She demoted herself to the lowest clerical grade on the payroll and continued working from the basement archives to prevent the operations I had disrupted from collapsing entirely. She did this without recognition, without thanks, and at a fraction of the wages she had earned. A quiet stir passed through the hall. Several of the older shareholders exchanged glances.
Over the past 5 months, Miss Vance has done the following. Thaddeus counted on his fingers as he spoke. She identified a systematic fraud within our own executive board that had drained over £90,000 from the syndicate over 10 years. She resolved a catastrophic freight crisis using a canal bypass system that she personally maintained in secret for 8 years. She coordinated our largest seasonal distribution from a frozen ridge outpost during the worst spring blizzard in living memory. And she helped recover the original founding records of this syndicate from a vault that was hours away from being destroyed. He let the words settle across the room.
The person responsible for the fraud has been removed from the board and has surrendered his shares. The full details are available in the financial summary that has been placed on your benches this morning, prepared entirely by Miss Vance. Papers rustled as shareholders reached for the bound documents on their seats. Thaddeus waited while they scanned the first few pages, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to astonishment. "Which brings me to the reason I am standing here today," Thaddeus said. "I came into this role believing that leadership meant authority, that the right title and the right connections were enough to run an enterprise of this scale. I was profoundly mistaken. Leadership is knowledge. It is patience. It is the willingness to understand something deeply before presuming to change it." He straightened and took a breath. "Effective immediately, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer of the Oakhaven Syndicate." The hall erupted. Shareholders turned to one another in confusion. Several men in the front row stood halfway from their seats. The murmur swelled into open exclamation. Thaddeus raised his hand and waited for quiet. "I am stepping down because this syndicate deserves to be led by the person who saved it. I am appointing Miss Corinne Vance as the sole director and managing head of the Oakhaven Syndicate, with full operational and financial authority over every division of the estate." He turned to Corinne and extended his hand toward the lectern. She rose from her chair, holding her ledger against her chest. For a moment, she stood very still, and Thaddeus saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. A brightness, a fullness, as if something she had carried alone for a very long time had finally been acknowledged. She walked to the lectern, set her ledger on its surface, and looked out at the assembled shareholders. The hall had gone quiet again. Every face turned toward her.
"Gentlemen," Corinne said, her voice clear and steady, "I have spent the last 6 years learning every river, every canal, every field, and every ledger entry on the Oakhaven estate. My father built its foundations with his hands. I intend to honor that work by building something that will outlast all of us." She opened her ledger to the first page. "Now then, shall we begin?" The applause started slowly, a few pairs of hands in the back row, and then it spread, bench by bench, until the Grand Assembly Hall on Threadneedle Street rang with it. Thaddeus stepped back from the platform and watched from the side of the room as Corinne Vance took command of the empire he had nearly destroyed, and began, with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, to lead it into its finest years.